Hello, everybody. It's great to see you all here. Thank you for joining us. We're just waiting for one or two more people to join, and then we'll be getting going. Okay, well, I think we should kick off. It's lovely to see everybody here. Thank you very much for joining us today. Late for some of you especially, and yeah, thank you for joining us from wherever you are. If you haven't met me before, I'm Ben Horton. I lead the Common Futures Conversations project here at Chatham House, and I'm really excited for this event on moving from protest movement to policy change. It's, as you know, the culmination of a month of dialogue on the platform. It's been really fascinating to hear your perspectives, and I'm really delighted that we can share them today with our panel. I'm not going to say anything else. I'm just going to sit back and listen. I'm going to hand you over now to my colleague Ahmed Suleiman from the Africa program at Chatham House, and he will be chairing today.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much for having me as chair of this really exciting event. It's a pleasure to be on with you and to be discussing this topic, moving from protest to policy change. As I understand that this month you've all been looking at ways in which you can improve the impact of protest movements and consider how these movements can drive policy changes. Especially in the light of events over the last 2 years, with 2019 being dubbed the year of protest and mass movements around the world calling for change, including during an environment of huge restrictions around COVID-19. But is protest and mass protest enough to encourage action from policymakers? And can civil society and other actors move from protests towards policy change? Well, this is the topic that we're here to discuss and shed more light on today with you all. And it's a pleasure really to be able to introduce my Africa program colleague, Dr. Lena Coney Hoffman, who I haven't seen in a while, but it's lovely to see. Lena will be joining us especially to talk about the situation in Nigeria, of course, with the protests around SARS. And just to introduce Lena briefly, Dr. Hoffman, I should call her, is an associate fellow of the Africa program and our Nigeria country lead for our social norms and accountable governance project. She's also a technical advisor on food security and agricultural policy to the Permanent Interstate Committee for Drought Control in the Sahel, and a member of the International Advisory Board of SOS Sahel as well. Her research focuses on corruption, on Nigeria's politics, security, and trade. And she's currently involved in researching socially shared beliefs, expectations, and informal institutions driving governance challenges in Nigeria and the wider West African context. To give you a brief introduction of myself as well, I'm a research fellow with the Africa program at Chatham House, and I lead the work on the Horn of Africa region and research on that part of the continent. So before we get started with our conversation, we've got a couple of housekeeping points that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. This event is fully on the record and the webinar is being recorded. We really welcome you to share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag #CHCommonFutures. We would very much highlight the Q&A function below at the bottom of your Zoom screens, and please ask you to submit your questions for our Q&A session by typing them in there. And you can do that at any stage, and we'll have a dialogue around that once we get to the Q&A session. So this webinar is part of the Common Future Conversations project, and as Ben mentioned, follows a month of dialogue on protest movements that you've already had and direct action within the community. So I think we can now start by having a conversation with Lena and introducing her and asking really what's happening in Nigeria. Lena, what's the situation with the protests there, and how do you see them evolving?
Hello, I think everyone can hear me.
We can hear you, Lena.
Excellent. I just got a dialogue on my screen saying I should unmute myself. Good evening, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. It's an absolute pleasure to be joining this conversation, this discussion today. I said yes to this because a lot of the questions that you all, this community, seem to be grappling with are questions that I've been also trying to make sense of over the last month since the protests began in Nigeria. So I'd like to kind of preface some of the comments I'll be making this evening with the caveat that I don't have a ton of answers and suggestions, just kind of clear cut or tried and tested suggestions on how protests shift or in a predictable fashion to changing and influencing policy. But I think it's worth having these conversations to kind of figure out the trajectory of things evolving across the continents that we occupy and the different countries that we are interested in. So I'll begin a bit with a few kind of broad strokes as to what's happening in Nigeria, and kind of based on Ahmed's first question. And it's really, a lot has happened in the month of October. It's been just kind of like a breathtaking, a fast-paced, fast-moving, fast-changing situation in Nigeria. But just quickly and very briefly, early in October, around about the 3rd of October, just a few hours after Nigeria's 60th anniversary celebration, independence celebration from British rule. So celebrations were on kind of the high of a 60th anniversary. 3 days later, there was this eruption of these protests, beginning mostly in the southern part of Nigeria, but erupted very quickly all across the country. The protests were triggered by a video that went viral of the killing of a young man in Ughelli in Delta State. This is south of Nigeria. And it kind of reignited this EndSARS movement or EndSARS protest. The hashtag has been online since 2017. Has been kind of, it's had waves of being viral, but really kind of in terms of the eruption from not just being on social media, but actually being on the street began as of early in October. There have been protests, there were protests nearly all across the country, over 30 states of Nigeria's 36 states since the start of the protest in early October, over the period of about 2 to 3 weeks. And tragically, the high of that the peak of the protests was somehow punctuated by incidences that occurred in the Lekki area. This is an upmarket, highbrow area of Lagos, Nigeria's commercial center, basically one of the biggest, definitely the biggest city in Nigeria, a commercial hub for West Africa. And if you've read the news, if you've read what's been happening since then, there is really, at this point in time, a month past the beginning of the protests, the huge kind of crescendo, the wave, the climax of it, and now trying to kind of understand what happens next. So this is the point in which we try to see or make sense of whether this protest evolves into a movement and what kinds of implications it has for governance systems and Nigeria's politics and just policy changes. That's kind of like what we're talking about this evening. But a couple of things that I think worth highlighting in talking about what's happening in Nigeria is the fact that context and history is key. So I'm just going to outline a few points as to, and I'm sure as we think about movements and social change in all the countries and the contexts and regions we're interested in, the kind of like underlining factor of context and history being key resonates across these different situations and scenarios. So one of the things that's quite clear with the protests and the movement, I'm inclined to call it a movement, and I'm sure maybe by the time I've kind of gone over the points that I wanted to, you kind of see the point I'm trying to make. Is really what's happened in Nigeria since the beginning of October have brought really into sharp focus a lot of the contradictions and contrasts and divisions in Nigerian society. And these are things that have been percolating under the surface for at least the last 2 decades, at the very, very least. And it's quite interesting that all of this came to a head in the month of October, 60 years after of Nigeria's independence or post-colonial history, and kind of highlighting a lot of Nigeria's democratic struggles and stagnation. So after 20 years or plus of democracy, Nigeria returned to democracy in 1999. It's kind of, the protest kind of revealed the fact that despite these 2 decades, Nigeria's social contract, particularly between government and Nigeria's youngest citizens, is incredibly weak and ineffective. Nigeria has one of the youngest populations on the continent, median age of 18, but over the last couple of years, in particular, the last 5 to 6 years, unemployment has been on the rise as well as underemployment. So the current generation of young people in Nigeria are uniquely deprived and uniquely disenfranchised by the state. And alongside that, alongside the disenfranchisement of Nigeria's youngest citizens and issues of rising poverty, issues of rising unemployment, food and nutrition security, Nigeria is one of the most food insecure countries in West Africa at the moment, deeply unequal society, and all of that. Alongside those quite gloomy trends, you have the reality that Nigeria's youngest citizens are its truest and most democratic generation. So in the 60 years of Nigeria, this is really the current 18 to 20-year-olds have had the longest experience of democracy in Nigeria. So kind of the awareness of democratic rights and constitutional rights and rights of expression and so on are very, very strong for this generation. And the ways in which the dynamics of the protests were, it suggests that they're more aware of their democratic rights than the history, Nigeria's long history of repressive government, repressive regimes. military regimes in particular. And another point to make about the protests is how they highlight the criminalization and suppression of youth in Nigeria. So it's really important not to look at SARS in isolation. And if you don't know what SARS is about, SARS is a unit of the Nigerian police force. SARS represents the Special Anti-Robbery Squad. It was created in 1992 to address violent crimes in Nigeria. It had an initial phase of success in addressing these violent crimes. We're talking armed robbery, kidnapping, and the like. But very quickly and soon after, the successes, the professionalism of the SARS unit took a dive. Nearly anyone who's ever, if you travel to Nigeria, if you are a frequent visitor to Nigeria, not of course in this 2020 year, everyone's got a story of an encounter, quite a really negative encounter with SARS. We're talking some really grim stuff. There have been several reports about police brutality and extortion by SARS over the years. But alongside those, despite reports and quite in-depth investigations into the operations of SARS, we've not had accountability of the police. But what's quite important to think about, think of SARS, is that it is part of, it's important not to think about it in isolation, but it's part of a larger whole. It's part of a long history in the Nigerian police force of brutality and violence. And an indication of this long history is the fact that it was only in this September that Nigeria's president, Muhammadu Buhari, assented to a new police act since Nigeria's colonial act of 77 years ago. So that's just kind of like an indication of how poorly served and just the history of repression that is built into the way in which Nigeria's police force operates. And it's not just the police force, we're talking intelligence services across the board that operate with this kind of repressive culture, and as well a culture of impunity. Another point to highlight, talking about the criminalization of youth and the tensions that the SARS protests reveal, is the fact that, and I kind of alluded to this, we're talking about the reports by human rights organizations. One of the primary ones that have been at the forefront of highlighting the abuses, the human rights abuses of SARS has been Amnesty International. But there've also been a number of local human rights organizations that have brought to light the patterns, quite sustained patterns of police brutality in Nigeria. And this kind of comes to, I guess, brings us to reflecting about how do you move from protest to police change, particularly in the context of such deep justice deficits and accountability hang-ups. And that is what I think a lot of watchers and observers of what's happened, of the government's response to the protests are looking at. At the present time, a number of states, I've lost count of maybe about 17, it might be more, of Nigeria's federal states have established judicial committees of inquiry. I'm not keen to hold my breath over what the outcomes would be of these panels of inquiry, because there have been reports by panels of inquiry in the past, and very similar to what happened, the tragic events at Lekki in Lagos, where soldiers allegedly shot on armed protesters, there has been reports of these kinds of events in the past, and one of the most prominent ones and really tragic ones happened in Zaria in 2015, where soldiers opened fire on members of the Islamic movement of Nigeria, killing around 348 members of the movement, including school children. There was a panel that was set up to investigate that and confirm these killings, but none of the soldiers have been brought to justice. So this raises a couple of questions, and I will kind of conclude with this question and one point. It raises the question, and I think for me, in looking at what's happening in Nigeria, is whether a unit such as SARS can be reformed, particularly in the context of how policing in Nigeria is highly politicized. The accommodations and arrangements between Nigeria's police and its political class and elites make this a very difficult prospect. So I'm really open to hearing from the community your thoughts in this, given this particular kind of context, because that is a question that I have tried to see if I could answer, and if there was any background or at least a history to draw answers from. So, because I guess since the beginning of the protests and the response from the government, so going from tear gas, a brutal crackdown, and now we are beginning to see quite a systematic disinformation campaign, just trying to muddy the narrative, muddy the waters. Did Lekki, were soldiers at Lekki, the state government, the obfuscation from the state government to the national government, the president taking his time to address the country and not mentioning what happened in Lekki. So we're seeing in real time a play on the facts, despite the fact that, you know, what happened in Lekki was live streamed. A lot of the photographs and lots of the witness statements and evidence has been checked and validated by, again, local journalists who are at great risk at the moment, and as well by human rights organizations. So the final kind of point I wanted to raise, that I think in the context of Nigeria, given the history of just the challenges and the uphill process that police reform has been, because we've been talking about police reform in Nigeria for a long time, is the fact that perhaps given the nature of the protests this time around, given the amplification using social media, Nigerians in diaspora, we might have shifted the trajectory of the protests, that we might be seeing a movement towards policy change and social change in Nigeria because of, in particular, international attention, monitoring the judicial process. We know that the International Criminal Court, for example, has its eyes on what is happening in Nigeria. The African Union, Human and People's Rights Commission have their eyes on what is happening to Nigeria. A number of Nigeria's international partners have spoken to what's happening in Nigeria. So this is kind of the first context of this kind of debate that this much international attention is on. And I want to just close my comments by saying that it's really, it's not, we shouldn't kind of play down the importance of international attention, particularly in the context of Nigeria, and there are lots of reasons as to why. But it's really important that international attention is focused on what is happening on the judicial panel level, but also in terms of the constraining of the civic space, attempts by the government to put in place a social media bill, and all of those other dynamics as to how the government is responding directly to the protests, but as well seeing as to how it can conscribe what happens in the future. So I'll just I'll end on that point as to the potential of international attention changing the trajectory of things, so we might be able to see this protest evolving to produce some policy changes or some changes in Nigeria's governance system.
Thank you very much, Lena. Thank you for providing that really interesting overview and context of what's happening in Nigeria with the End SARS movement. And I think for me, I felt, I didn't want to interrupt you, but there were a lot of parallels there with some of the countries that I follow, in particular Sudan. And thinking about the issues around security sector reform, even in a country where protest movement has led to direct change within the government over the last year, and where you now have people who were actively protesting on the streets as part of government, you know, either in civil service or as ministers. But what you see there with the change there is that one of the key things lagging is in the area of security sector reform, even though it was one of the, you know, the critical demands of protesters at the time. And partly that's a balance between the interests that you mentioned, the elite interests that remain, those who have the guns and the money, who are still part of the government. You know, you have a civilian military transition taking place there in a very fine balance to try and keep some sort of stability in the country. And so I think what you've seen as a result is a real lag in reforming some of the security sector organs, including the police. So really fascinating to hear you to speak about those issues in Nigeria. I think we're going to move on now to the next part of the conversation, which is to hear from our community speakers. And they've been putting together some ideas about effective protest movements. And I think it's our job, Lena, to provide some feedback on this, to listen first and then have an interaction. So I'd like to call on Salome and Zuki first, if you'd like to unmute yourself and come forward and present your example of policy change and what you'd like to see. I think Salome is on the way. There we have you. Salome, are you able to join us and unmute yourself? I think we're getting there.
There we are.
Sorry, I had an unexpected internet problem.
That's okay. We're very used to those these days, Salome, so that's no problem at all. Please go ahead.
Okay, so the idea that I shared on the platform on how we can move from protest to policy change, and I entitled it communicating, you have to communicate what you want. And I gave an example of a protest in Kenya that was popularly known as My Dress, My Choice, whereby there were several cases of abuse of women in bus stages and also in buses while on transit. And also women were being stripped because of their dressing and the matatus, we call buses matatus here. So the staff would say, this is inappropriate and we're going to strip you, or they say hi to you, or they catcall you and you give them an attitude, or you don't respond back and they strip you. And the women of Kenya were tired and they went to the streets and they protested, and they said that my dress, my choice, and they affirmed that the Constitution of Kenya says that no one should be discriminated based on their dressing, but that was what was happening to women. And there was no specific law that said it is illegal to strip women. So the women pushed for this, and there was a Security Act that now says it's illegal to push to strip women, and if you strip women, it's a crime, and you're going to be prosecuted for that. And there were also special police who are set up in downtown areas to look out if women are being violated. So from that protest, we had change, because the women, me being one of them, were very clear what we wanted, that women should not be violated, and women have a right to decide how they want to dress, and this is not any justification for them to be abused. So for me, any protest moving forward, there has to be like a tangible demand, and what do we want, like what's the end game. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salome. Lena, do you have any initial response to Salome's presentation?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I guess we can get kind of like nuggets along the way as we listen to the other presenters. But I think one of the useful points, or useful clear dynamic that played a role with the protests in Kenya is the clarity of a demand. So I will, of course, kind of try and compare that with what happened, what's happening in Nigeria. That the clarity of the demand, I think initially in the early stages, it was really end SARS. That was like the clear statement of the protest. It's in the hashtag. It's really hard to confuse it. But I guess quite similar to my dress, my choice, is the fact that underlying, these quite simple and clear demands are kind of wider social issues. So you have NSARS and it's this police unit, but underneath that is the wider issue of police brutality. It's the wider issue of the criminalization of young people in Nigeria. It's the wider issue of governance, supporting those at the top and disadvantaging those at the bottom. So with the my dress, my choice, underneath really just that simple demand are wider issues of gender inequality and gender equity and personhood and physical integrity and all of those other issues that I'm sure Kenya, and I know Nigeria for as well, grapples with taking seriously and as well implementing, even though constitutions say genders are equal, women and men are equal, but actually taking issues of sexual harassment seriously. Some of the work that we've done around corruption was looking at sextortion, and also kind of paying attention to how that's increasingly issues of sexual harassment and sexual abuse and sextortion in particular being taken seriously by international organizations and national, and seeing countries governments beginning to realize that the training around sexual harassment should be part of what is a regular feature in judiciaries and legal systems. So legal support should be able to legal aid should be able to deal with, you know, accusations of sexual harassment and the like, and know how to prosecute these and deal with them and take them seriously. Because it's not something to just laugh about, oh, well, just shake it off. So one day somebody said, well, I'm not going to shake it off, I'm going to protest. So that the system goes from not just being one of protesting, but that there are legal channels if you are on your own, if you are subject to harassment because of what you are wearing, that you know that I have recourse to justice. So it's interesting, you know, that a lot of these issues, you have the simple demand, but there are really wider structural dynamics that come into play with actually moving, that allow you move from a protest to policy change and social change.
Thank you, Lina, and thank you, Salome, very much for presenting your policy change example. I think we'll, in the interest of time, have to move on to the next example, and I'd like to call on Hugo Barail, if I'm saying that correctly. Apologies if I'm not. Please do unmute yourself and please do tell us about your case.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my idea is just related to the fact of dialogue. I wanted to really pick something that could transcend all movements, in the sense that all movements are different. They all have their own national context, historical context, like you mentioned, Dr. Hoffman. And I want dialogue to be a top priority of all protest movements, or at least the second one in case the government is not responsive to the people in general. I think this has multiple advantages. For example, I think this is the complete polar opposite of violence, in the sense that it doesn't make any enemies when you seek violence, whereas when you encourage violence, you alienate a lot of more moderate people against you. I think it also legitimizes the cause into a very concrete mechanism, and I think it also makes it very trackable, in the sense that citizens who are not so involved in the movement are able to see the progress more clearly. And it also offers those in power something tangible, something they can grab and something they can participate in as well. And also international actors. Let's not forget about international actors, whether it's international bodies such as the UN, or Dr. Hoffman mentioned Amnesty International, very important NGO. It gives those international organizations as well something that they can work with. I included in my example different mechanisms that are very different according to the circumstances. Some are better for some cases and some are better for other cases. For example, I use the example of referendums, which protests can include in their demands, because referendums are a very good way to quantify popular support into a number that they can then show to those in power and be like, X amount of people support my cause. But of course, referendums can be very polarizing and they're not very useful for very complex issues. So then I propose citizen assemblies. Citizen assemblies are very good at bringing people together on very complex issues. And they've proven, social research has proven that when implemented well, they are very, very good at bringing people from both sides of the political spectrum, or both sides of the argument, into some form of consensus. And then the last example that I included was the role of civil society. I think the role of civil society makes the cause of protesters very manageable. They're often people with a lot of experience, and also they can be very useful in the sense that they can get involved with international actors such as the UN. There's various legal processes that the UN has to get civil society actors more participation into the legislative and human rights side. And I think all of these examples show how important protest can be, but also how sustainable change can be when it is achieved. Not only because the cause in itself is accepted by a wider range of the population, but also because future protest movement can then use these precedents for their own cause. Precedents are very important, and I think that in the future, when X protest movement emerges, they can say, but in the past, these worked for them, so it should work for us as well. And I think that's very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo. That was really, really fascinating. And I think I fully agree with you in terms of what you've outlined. I think the key thing that I took away from what you said was really the need to move protest movements from the street to the office, if you will, for a simplified version, just ensuring that there are mechanisms to institutionalize policy change, moving that protest into an institutional form of change and enabling that to take place. I think, what you allude to is really a form of responsible citizenship. And that, citizens really also are beholden in terms of their interest and their demands. They have an obligation to be able to provide solutions themselves. And to institutionalize those solutions and to ensure that they're inclusive and that there are mechanisms, as you rightly say, by which others can follow those changes in the future, and that the changes can impact the majority. So I think that's really fascinating, the way that you've outlined that, the kind of the different options, including citizen assemblies that you've mentioned as well, and referendums as well. I think ensuring that there are these avenues for dialogue are extremely important when you're looking for core demands, key demands, really to be enacted with change. Lena, I don't know if you have any additions as well to that.
No, I just want to, I will agree with you. I'll definitely, agree with you, Hugo. Dialogue is better than violence. And I really do like the idea of setting a precedent, because in terms of thinking about deepening democracies, and we're seeing democracies in peril around the world, having these precedents in place where you have these options of moving from, just the trigger or the ignition of a protest to evolving, that if democracies around the world, and particularly in the African context that we're looking at, and Ahmed talked about Sudan, and I was talking about Nigeria, that these things become natural and part of the process of engagements between, this is part of civic engagement. It is not a threat to regimes, it is not a threat to governments. The governments become accustomed and relaxed about their citizens making demands, and you're able to transition neatly with as little, of the kind of heat that causes violence, from a protest to dialogue. And you have these options, and they are normalized, as it were. I really do like the option of citizen assemblies, and that is actually something I was thinking about in the context of Nigeria, and thinking that, or hoping that it's one of the things that we would track and see if the protests in Nigeria move from just being a protest to the movement, is if it evolves into these kinds of assemblies where you have citizens engaging with the government at the local level. So these citizens assemblies really work very well for local engagement, and as a forum, and just even being cathartic for protesters and citizens to feel that they're part of governance, and they're holding their governments accountable. So I really do like the idea of that, and really just that the concept of it becoming a precedent, as opposed to thinking about protests associating with violence, but thinking about protests associating protests with dialogue. Really sounds very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hugo. And we will move on to the next intervention now, which is from Laura Sanzarello. Laura, welcome, and please do give us your case study. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this discussion. It's been really interesting so far. So the idea that I shared with the community was with regards to the relevance that media coverage, and especially in the latest decade, social media have in respect to the actual achievements of the protest goals. So over the years, protests have brought significant change in societies and have been effective in promoting justice and equality. While on the other hand, they've also placed protesters in delicate situations, especially if political and physical exposure. And we've been seeing examples of this in Hong Kong, Belarus, Nigeria, and as we talked about, and even the US. So media attention has in many cases played a crucial role in dictating the evolution and outcomes of social movements like the Arab Spring or the Me Too movement, and from the spread the world effect to image and video sharing, hashtags, and the creation of a solid network and follow. Social media help in channeling the sentiment at the basis of protests and maximize its echo on both the national and international level, inspiring consensus and solidarity. So obtaining the attention of external actors and institutions, in fact, contributes to preventing the state from ignoring the matters, animating protesters, or poorly addressing them to get just to get off the hook of public scrutiny. So a broader audience might guarantee better accountability, more effective solutions, and a greater pressure on governments to react fast to the problems and the social issues voiced by the people, increasing the chances of bringing actual change to those affected. So the insurgence of Corona also has showed the importance of digital participation in protest, because an example could be the great visibility that hashtags like Black Lives Matter, End SARS, or just the Vote campaign have gained around the world. Something that in the current state of things and with social gatherings and physical participation being discouraged would have never been as powerful and impactful. So given this, the take out of my idea was that social movements actually need or work better in, like, if they're helped or if they're cited by media participation and media coverage. So my actual question would be if you would agree with this aspect, or if instead you believe that sometimes even media might damage protests, maybe distorting their messaging or losing them in translation and hence undermining the possible gains. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Lena, would you like to take a first stab?
I will take a first stab, and I do like the sequence of things. And I would definitely concur with the notion, just the idea that a broader audience makes a huge difference, and the role of media as well. And I guess this is, like, you know, your presentation alluded to, is this is a thread that you can find in many of the protests that we are observing occurring around the world. The crucial role of this broader audience, these more eyes, different types of eyes, international community, citizens around the world, and just the globalization of many local social movements have contributed to their sustenance and their impact as well. I share your thoughts around what it means for media being involved, and I share those thoughts thinking about what's happened with the narrative in Nigeria. I think what's a concern and what is might deflate the protest in Nigeria is the focus on what happened in Lagos as opposed to what's been happening across Nigeria. So it's sort of allowed for what would be a movement that reflected broader socioeconomic groups, a very diverse coalition, has sort of been kind of framed with this very Lagos, and Lagos is not a it does not reflect the wider dynamics of Nigeria. So that's actually a problem for the protest, because it was really impactful and happened across Nigeria, particularly Nigeria's conservative north, but that narrative didn't come out internationally. So there are lots of kind of implications for that for Nigeria's divisions, Nigeria's regions, and the like. So the role of the media in framing what's more easy to understand, what are the simple narratives that you can extract and extrapolate and make international, that is a problem. So I guess what would be a balance to that is just citizens journalism and strong local journalistic networks and investigative journalism at a local level, and that kind of reporting. But I do share that concern, because that is actually, for contexts that are less poorly understood around the world, they really, that is a trap that a lot of protests fall into, these kinds of simple narratives that work well in international media, limiting the local on-the-ground impact of a movement, when it could be embraced by more coalitions on the ground that could actually make them impactful long term. Yeah.
Thank you. Laura, I think I'd add as well your cautionary note at the end about how media can sometimes damage and distort protest movements. I think that's a very interesting thing, and something that we need to be more mindful of, given the advancements in digital technologies and the appropriation of that technology by different sources, be it government, be it private sector, be it local constituencies who are looking to propagate their own side of the story, or to reverse the side of the story, as it were. So I think that's something that you brought up that's really fascinating, and we see more of in elections, around protest movements and other things, this counter narrative of the story being propagated. So very interesting. And then who, when things are online, who do you believe, and what is the truth? So that's really interesting. Thank you very much. So moving on to the last, but certainly not the least, Zakaria Uada, if you could please also come along and give us your case study. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. It was a pleasure hearing Dr. Hoffman and my fellow members and their ideas. The idea that I had proposed earlier is titled A Dance with the Devil, and that is a mention to an analogy that the previous doctor that was a guest of ours has mentioned, where she said that a protest or a social movement is essentially a dance with the government. And I find that this dance might not be fair, and the government is a partner nowadays in this modern time and place. The governments do not respect human rights and do not respect their own standards and principles. The perfect example is the previously mentioned End SARS movement, where the government did not even bother fixing this issue or addressing it in the beginning of the issues arising. The idea that I'm proposing is the formation and the creation of let's say, a branch of the UN that is dedicated and destined to protect the protest movements and the human rights of protesters in each country. And not only that, but being the middleman and the mediator between the government and the leaders of said social movement or protest. Some might say that the UN is a huge institution that is not easily modified or encouraged to adapt to modern situations, but I believe that the UN is one of the greatest achievements of humanity as a whole. And regardless of it being nowadays manipulated or influenced by individual interests or unilateral interests, I find that the UN has the capacity to influence and to persuade governments to answer popular demands. This branch will be responsible of sending, let's say, not expeditions, but how can I say, to send a team to each country, to a delegation, rather a delegation to each country that surveys the current situation, that works in collaboration with prominent protest movements and politicians that are opposing, working in collaboration with them to, first of all, supervise the actions of the government or the country that is concerned, and also provide a form of legal protection for the leaders of this movement, because as we all know, a protest or a social movement is as good as its leadership is. And often in corrupt third world countries, we find that the first step a government takes is heading towards the leadership and the prominent figures, quote unquote, saying to kill a snake, you just have to cut its head. Therefore, they will create a chaos. They will create chaos and division among the protesters themselves and lead to furthermore escalation, to furthermore risk of this instability in the region and the country as a whole. And that is why I believe that the United Nations has a responsibility to put these nations and to put these governments at fault and to put them at responsibility, either by imposing sanctions on said officials that have, for example, foreign interests and foreign bank accounts, so and so, or even imposing embargoes or economical sanctions on countries that do not respect the mission destined of the mission engaged by this delegation in this country, that do not answer the demands that have been proposed both by the delegation and by the protest movement to settle this in a civil manner without any escalation. Because as we know, for example, I would give an example where the United Nations played a huge role. For example, the SALT Treaty, the SALT 1 and 2 Treaty concerning the nuclear arms race, where the United Nations paid attention and realized the risk of a nuclear clash between two major powers. But what we find is, throughout the history of humanity, protests and the escalation of protests has caused more death and destruction than nuclear attacks. For example, Syria has 200,000 and still counting dead and hundreds and millions of refugees. Yemen has 150,000 dead and countless refugees. And to avoid this and to preserve the interest of regional neighbors of that said country, I believe the UN must create a branch that is not working in collaboration, but that answers and sends its reports to the UN Security Council, where most importantly, there needs to be a fast and swift reaction to avoid further escalation. Because if the UN involves itself in peacekeeping forces, let's say, the die is cast. There is no going back. The system and the regime has fallen. The country is in chaos. Even if huge funds and humanitarian aid is sent, it will be in vain, because it will be virtually impossible to recreate order from within the chaos in a short period of time.
Zakaria, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we very much get your point, and it's really interesting what you highlight, and I think it's a huge topic for us to tackle and to end on. Really, the kind of essentially what you're talking about not only is the United Nations, the role of the United Nations, and being consisting of its member states, and really reflecting the interests of its member states, which reflect many of the limitations, therefore, of its intervention. But you're, I think, suggesting really what a number of people, a number of institutions, a number of NGOs are calling for, which is really a wider reform of the United Nations, which would enable it to be more flexible, to work with representatives of popular and social movements, to try and facilitate dialogue, to try and implement swifter sanction where there are injustices around the world. I think, what would be required for that to take place is really a huge revisiting of what the purpose of the UN and the structure of the UN is in the first place. And who is reflective of that structure. I mean, certainly the Security Council, as you mentioned, is only reflective of a very narrow set of interests, certainly not global interests. And so, the need for potential reform of the Security Council in itself would be a first step to a more level playing field and perhaps to more just interventions on other issues that aren't necessarily deemed priorities currently. I don't know, Lena, if you have any insights that you want to add to that.
Just thank you so much, Zachariah. And I wish we had more time to listen to the full breadth of your contributions. As you were speaking, I couldn't agree with your points more strongly around the fact that the international systems and the UN being at the heart of these should be paying attention to the trend of these youth-led protest movements around the world, and the fact that around issues of climate change, around issues of democratic rights and so on, the pattern suggests that this will continue and maybe even become more intense in many parts of the world. So in terms of being responsive and proactive rather than reactive, having improving its mechanisms, and Ahmed already talked about the kinds of so we're talking about police reform in Nigeria, but the international dimension of this conversation is about reforming a lot of these international mechanisms so they are fit for purpose for the 21st century, for all of the challenges that the world as it is facing. And to the point you were making about Syria and Yemen, an argument can be made about the insurgency in Nigeria, which is in its 10th year, that it began with an extrajudicial killing, the killing of the leader of the Boko Haram group. And members of the group protested the killing of their founder and were trying to bury other members that were killed, but they were cracked down upon by the Nigerian police. And now we found ourselves in a situation where the northeast of Nigeria is facing a humanitarian crisis, the likes of which, we don't know when these will be resolved. So there is a strong argument to be made about for the international system to be more proactive, given the ways in which our connected, globalized world trends spike and escalate and unravel very, very quickly. And there is a lot that can be avoided if the international system was more proactive, more agile, and more nimble, and sanctions were more targeted. One of the pieces I wrote around what happened in Nigeria was this idea of financial restrictions and travel restrictions being targeted as opposed to targeting the whole country, targeting individuals and political elites that have a hand in repressing or repressing people, human rights, and participating in suppressing protests. So our thoughts are aligned in that area. But thank you so much for a very, very powerful and just very powerful contributions to this discussion. And it's really good to see a lot of similar patterns and similar trends. And I've learned a lot. So thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you very much, Lena, for joining us today and for providing your expertise and insights. I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us and for allowing us to be a part of your conversation. I found it really interesting to experience, some of the topics of this particular topic on moving from protest to policy change, and wish you all extremely well with your continued conversations on the platform. With that, wish you all a very pleasant day or evening wherever you are, and all the best for the future. Thank you very much.